So it looks like we're live. So, Rick, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
An evangelist. That means I travel around to campuses around the country, meet with students, often have friendly debates, dialogues with Muslims and atheists and whatever worldview. Try to make a case for the Christian faith, um, and I think try to model something for students that is along the lines of civil dialogue and respect. I grew up in Marshall, Minnesota, and came to faith when I was a late teenager and joined university. And now I have a family, and I live in St. Paul, here, St. Paul, Minnesota. I went to Bethel Seminary, studied philosophy of religion there. And I've got two kids, five grandkids now, five grandsons. Tom, you got to meet them sometime. And, one wife, not a polygamist, one wife, and I play guitar, and I'm a very serious golfer. I play golf.
Oh, you play guitar? I do too. You should come and teach me
Oh,
sometime. I've been trying to
oh,
learn
okay.
how.
Well, you and I have hung out a couple times, so let's do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I've been working on trying to explain my position more clearly, and so I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction. Let me know what you think. So,
Okay.
I am an atheist, by which I mean I don't believe there's any reason to believe in the existence of a God. And the reason I believe this is because I think all of the arguments, the classical arguments, can be answered equally by unknown natural causes as they can supernatural causes. Using supernatural just to represent God here, it may or may not be an accurate term. So I think that we can explain, like, for example, the origin of the universe could be explained by an all powerful being, but it could also just be explained by an all powerful universe, like naturalistic pantheism is my go to argument. And so I don't think that argument indicates a God because it can be explained equally by a non God. And I think that all of the arguments seem to have that same kind of a property where they could be explained by a designer, like the fine tuning argument, but they could also be explained by an unknown natural thing, for example, an undiscovered property that interconnects all of the boundary conditions, which is what Stephen Hawking argued for to explain the fine tuning. And it seems to me like all of the arguments can be explained that way, even the moral argument. It's not that like scientists could propose things like this and say that general relativity is all powerful, therefore we don't need a God because it explains the origin of everything, or general relativity includes an undiscovered law of nature, which is just the moral law of nature. And they could explain these things in this way, they just don't because they aren't verifiable properties. They're not a combination of verifiable things, and so scientists don't choose to assert explanations for those, whereas opposed to theologians really do a lot. And it seems to me that scientists could. There's nothing holding them back from doing this other than just their own inhibition to make those kinds of leaps. And so it seems that the only advantage theism has over naturalism is the fact that it's making leaps beyond the verifiable, where science could do that, it just doesn't. So none of the arguments seem to indicate a God. They just seem to be leaps past the verifiable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, and could you share what you mean by verifiable and why that's so important?
Sure. So I mean, like, to be more specific, it's future verifiable testable prediction. So it's being able to say, if my theory is right, then here's something we can predict in the future that we don't know yet. And if we can verify that that is correct, then there's a good reason to believe that this hypothesis is correct. And the reason that's important is because we need some way to differentiate between imaginary things and things that exist in the world. Like, for example, if we see a cup fall over, there's infinitely many things that can explain how it fell over. Maybe it was the wind, maybe somebody knocked the table over, maybe it was a bird or a rabbit or a squirrel or something, maybe it was leprechauns or aliens or a god.
Right.
So we need some way to differentiate between all these different hypotheses. And looking at past and present data doesn't work because all of the different hypotheses can explain the past and present data. Like, for example, if you said a mouse knocked the cup over and you say, well, oh, if we see mouse droppings around the cup, well, that can be explained because the mouse knocked over the cup and left the droppings. But if we don't see any mouse droppings, you can say, well, the mouse just didn't leave any droppings, it hadn't eaten yet. So either way, whether we see mouse droppings or not, since we already know that, we can already post hoc explain that by looking at past and present data. But the one thing we can't do is look into the future. Like, if I can make a future testable predictions, there will be mouse droppings that we haven't discovered yet in this location, and we discover that to be correct, that's a good reason to believe that hypothesis is better than the alternatives, as opposed to just post hoc explaining what we already see.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm with you on that. And then when I was looking at one of your talks and just remembering to a time you and I got together, you also believe that if there are gaps in our knowledge now, that maybe theists tend to just plug in God, and you end up with this weird God of the gaps thing. I think I've heard you say, Tom, that maybe at some time in the future, naturalism will come up with an explanation for things. We just don't know what it is yet. But based on the success of science and naturalism in the past, we can project forward that perhaps in the future, these explanations will come. And then just reading between the lines, I don't know if you've said this, but even if they don't come, that's not necessarily a reason to overthrow naturalism. Is that true?
Sort of. I would propose it more like in the form of a argument from induction. Like if we see white goose, white goose, white goose, white goose, white goose, and we have an empty space and we don't know what it's going to be, we're going to say it's probably going to be a white goose. That seems to be the most reasonable conclusion. And so in the case of naturalism, where we see lightning was caused by natural causes, fairy circles were natural causes, the motion of the sun was natural causes, everything we've ever discovered has been a natural cause and not a supernatural God kind of a thing. It seems reasonable to assume that the next unknown is also going to be a natural cause.
Yeah. I think I could say the same thing about all of those phenomenon and say that God is involved, that God has given an orderly universe to us as a gift for us to enjoy and explore and understand. And I guess I don't see that God would necessarily be incompatible with any of those natural causes. That science has been given to us as a gift, that we should be engaged in good science. We shouldn't just play the God card any old time we want to. That the universe has its own kind of internal integrity that makes science a valuable tool, but it's still a gift from God. And so all of those phenomena you just talked about, I wouldn't be very quick to say, oh, well, anything that we don't quite understand, well, God did it, and we don't really have to do any more science. I'd say, no, let's get busy, do some really good science, and let's be rigorous in our studies so we can come up with a natural explanation. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, it's a natural explanation in the natural world, but it's all been given to us by a caring and loving God.
Well, that could absolutely be the case. I'm not saying that science is incompatible with God. I'm just saying
Yeah,
that
okay, right.
when you insert God as the final explanation, it
Yeah,
could be the case that there's just the final explanation is also a natural thing and not a God.
yeah, I agree. It could be. We're on the same page so far, sort of.
Yeah. So my question would be: is there any real reason? Is there any of the classical arguments? Do you think they work to indicate a God as opposed to an unknown natural cause, or do you think they do indicate a God as opposed to an unknown natural cause, more so or less so?
Right, yeah. Well, as I said off air, I'm not a professional philosopher, and some of the guests you've had on, I've been so impressed. You got Paul Copan and David Clark and Robin Collins, and they're famous and they're real philosophers. I'm not, but more of a generalist, someone who goes to campus and has these discussions. So I hope your viewers are not disappointed. But, I do sit with atheist and agnostic students and professors around the country, Tom, and I hear their concerns. And one of their concerns is that if they open the door to anything beyond naturalism, then it's like, well, anything goes, open the floodgates. In other words, if you don't draw the line at naturalism, then you open the door to mythology or magic, and there's this slippery slope and fairies and Jesus. I mean, it's all kind of the same, and we don't want to allow either. And then some of my atheist friends, and as I've gotten to know them better and so forth, having these conversations, then they're concerned, well, where's that going to lead? Next thing you know, we're going to have prayer in public schools and forced religious training and a theocracy or whatever. I think these are valid concerns. We have enough wacko thinking in our culture, and it seems like science and naturalism would be really good tools and good reference points to bring some sanity back into education and back into pop culture, back into politics, for example, and back into the marketplace. But I do think that Christianity, rightly practiced, does the same thing and emphasizes more of the subjective parts of life than does naturalism. And so, Tom, my fear about naturalism is that it seems very mechanistic and kind of robotic to me. It doesn't naturally and easily support emotion, except as a chemical, or loyalty, or intention, or aesthetics, or human relationships. Again, except in a kind of mechanical way. And so, all that to say that I'm kind of concerned. I'm worried that the rise of naturalism these days can have a dehumanizing effect on our experience, a dehumanizing effect on culture. And when naturalists do act in deeply human ways, which they totally do, I'm not saying they don't, they do, to my thinking, they seem to lack the intellectual resources to explain it. And it seems better explained to me by Christian theism. So just one quick story. I don't mean to digress. I hope I'm beginning to answer your question. One of my friends, whose also name is Tom, he converted from atheism to Christianity, and he's a lawyer in Minneapolis the last few years, and I was in his office recently, and he just looked at me, he said, "Rick, what is this that we're having right now? What is this human interaction that we're having right now? How do you explain it? In fact, how do you explain experience? How do you explain the soul? Just in purely physical, mechanical, and chemical ways?" And he said, "No, there's something about subjective experience. God is in this. It's a gift from God." Tom came to faith because he found hope in Jesus, and he was not finding hope in a meaningless universe. So I guess I'm interested in a worldview that is internally coherent and externally offers explanatory value for all of reality and experience. And I guess I'm reluctant to make any rules in advance of what that worldview might be. So if I thought naturalism was internally coherent and provided comprehensive explanatory value, then I'd probably do it. I'd consider it for sure. Well, I have considered it. Or if I thought some sort of idealism or a Cartesian demon, provided that sort of internal coherence and external comprehensive explanatory power, I would do that, or Eastern pantheism, or whatever. I don't care, honestly. But for me, Christianity does provide that. It provides an explanation for existence and value and ethics, explains why the world is both good and bad, and why I'm both good and bad. And it seems to embrace the gift of science so we can study God's world and make it a better place. So I'm not exactly doing the classical Christian arguments here, but I am sort of saying I'm drawn and I'm committed to Christian theism because, to me, it is the most internally consistent, most externally comprehensive worldview that I know of, especially when I line it up with atheism. No disrespect intended there.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, thanks. And then secondly, Tom, I guess I'm just really, really drawn to Jesus. He was a revolutionary in his day. He stood up against organized religion that had become corrupt in places. He broke cultural rules about relating to women and to other races, to Gentiles. And, it was very much of a no-no to have interaction with women and non-Jews during that day, because you would be considered unclean. You'd be contaminated. But in fact, Jesus honored women. And when I read the story in John 4 of Jesus interacting with a woman at the well, I just find it very compelling the way he honored this broken woman, or the woman caught in adultery in John 8 or 12, I think it is, or the woman who was bleeding, who was hemorrhaging for years, and the compassion that Jesus had on her. Or when a prostitute came and crashed a party that Jesus was attending at the house of a Pharisee, and the way he honors that woman. I'm really drawn to that. He taught people to love their neighbors, but also taught them to love their enemies. He sacrificed himself for their sins. He sacrificed himself. He gave his life for the world. He gave his life for me, and that really gets my attention. So I guess I'm really drawn to someone who would give their life for me. So if I can just summarize here, Tom, because I don't want to just go on, and I know you probably want to jump in here in a moment. For me, all the bases are covered, and I'm not saying they're covered perfectly. I'm still learning, and honestly, I'm still open to whatever truth is out there, even if it is different than the truth I hold to currently. But the Bible seems to give comprehensive answers that fit together like puzzle pieces about where did the world come from? Where did life come from inside the world? What's the meaning of life and the meaning of our existence? What's the basis for ethics? How do we make ethical decisions? What happens after death? Why does the world seem both good and bad? Why do I seem both good and bad? Where's my hope? How can I best use science? How can I have an integrated life that leads to human flourishing? How can I care about atheists when some of them, not you, but when some of them seem to just want to run me into the ground? And I'll just close here by saying that a couple of years ago, we were at church, and my wife Sharon experienced a really dramatic healing. She had kind of a long-term inflammation and a problem with her shoulder, and it was just chronic pain. Not, well, I shouldn't say it was kind of this dull ache all the time that she'd been dealing with for a long time. And so some friends came, and we just had this special time of prayer. And Sharon's shoulder was healed that very day after, I don't know, maybe a couple of years of really being troublesome to her. Now, when I look at that healing incident and many others that I've seen and experienced, I don't think that really proves Christianity. It does maybe put a dent in naturalism. Maybe it suggests that there's something beyond the natural realm. Now, that healing happens to fit perfectly into my worldview. So I consider it a miracle from God that Jesus chose to heal that day. Now, sometimes healing doesn't happen or doesn't work, and I don't know why. But that day it did, and it happened right after praying to Jesus. But all that to say that that incident of healing, it fit naturally with my worldview. It was a kind of confirmation of things that I already believe. And I know the argument about confirmation bias, but I'm talking about confirmation in a slightly different way here, meaning that it wasn't super surprising to us that after we prayed, Sharon was healed, but it just gave us so much joy and so much hope that this could happen in other places, which it has. So I guess, Tom, what I'm trying to say is that in terms of my choice of worldviews, it could be pantheism, or it could be naturalism, or it could be Cartesian idealism or something like that, or it could be Christian theism. And to me, to my thinking, Christian theism seems to be the most plausible to provide the most answers in a comprehensive way. And that's why I hold to it. And thanks for letting me share that.
Yeah, no problem. So there were a few points there I wanted to touch on. The first one
Yeah.
was you said, bring science back to politics. Now, I think I disagree with you on this one. I don't remember a time when science was ever in politics to begin with. But that's so.
Hey, I'm
That's a
talking
different
just
topic.
about sane scientific thinking about global warming, for
Right,
example.
right,
That would be an example.
right. And I would agree with you on the second point where you talked about the supernatural. I don't think we can exclude the supernatural. I'm totally open to the supernatural.
Yeah,
If you can
yeah,
provide future testable predictions, like if I could pray to a god or a leprechaun or something, and every time I did, a gold brick appeared in front of me, that's great evidence. Or if, like you said, the healings. If healings were reliable and you could pray to a specific god and the healing would happen for that god and only that god, that would be really good evidence for a god. I haven't seen that. It seems to be
sure.
pretty evenly balanced out between religious people and non-religious people all across the world and across cultures. So I don't think that's evidence of a god particularly. It may be evidence of here's something we don't understand, but I don't think it would be evidence of a god or a supernatural because again that could just be an unknown natural
Yeah,
process causing those
exactly.
healings.
Yeah. If I was in your position, that's what I'd be saying.
And I could say the same thing about where you mentioned love and purpose and meaning and justice and value and hope. Like all of those things could also be explained by unknown natural processes. Like we just don't know about them yet. So it doesn't seem to me that naturalism can't provide those answers. It
Right.
just
I agree.
doesn't. It doesn't jump to the conclusion that we have answers to those. It just says we don't know. And there could be an answer, there may not be an answer, whereas opposed to theism jumps to the conclusion that they have an explanation. And I
Yeah.
don't see there's anything stopping scientists from doing the same thing and just saying, here's an undiscovered law of nature, this could be solving it.
Sure.
They just don't. So, from my perspective, it seems like naturalism can equally provide a grounds to explain all of those things. It just chooses to reserve judgment until it has verifiable evidence. And that seems to be the major difference between the theistic and naturalistic worldview that I see, and why I choose to value or choose to trust the naturalistic worldview better is because it has that law in it that it's without evidence with reserved judgment. And that seems to be a really applicable, useful thing that has turned out to be successful throughout history reliably.
Yeah. I think a certain prudence is really helpful. And that's why I did qualify my statement about healing a little bit. It seems to fit in my worldview, and it seems to be a sort of confirmation of that there is a God. When we prayed, and then an hour later, she was healed. And so I'm sort of with you on this reserving judgment, because we could be wrong about this. It could have been some other force that we don't know about that healed Sharon. Maybe some people, unlike Sharon, she'd be a super reliable testimony, but maybe other people might exaggerate or whatever. She would never do that. And so I too want to be cautious, I guess, about, just immediately saying, well, there's your proof. And I don't think that's the case. This side of heaven, I'm stuck in this imperfect body with this imperfect mind that's trying to make sense of the reality around me. And I'm open to the possibility of what you're saying, that there's some unknown natural cause of these things that we just haven't gotten there yet. And as science makes its advances, we might get there, and that might nudge out God in certain places. So I'm open to that. Still, for the time being, your judgment is that naturalism provides an equal or better explanation of these things, and my judgment, kind of as your friend, is that theism provides an equal or better explanation of these things. And then, so you sort of end up with two friends here who are kind of in a draw about these things, because it's a judgment call. You favor judgment here, I favor it here. And so we end up in this parallel conversation, I guess. I'm in this universe, you're in this universe, and we're sort of sharing things from our universes, it seems to me.
Well, you said that theism could be a better explanation. Could you explain how is it just a judgment, a feeling kind of a thing? Is there a justifiable reason or evidence behind that?
Yeah, I was reading Thomas Nagel, famous atheist Thomas Nagel, and reading famous atheist Michael Ruse about consciousness.
Is Mind and Cosmos?
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, Mind and Cosmos from Thomas Nagel, and a book on ethics. I forget where Michael Ruse has an extended explanation, extended essay in there. Can't think of the name of that book right now. Something about ethics. But anyway, both atheist philosophers that I really respect, I mean, they're really uncomfortable with the idea of consciousness arising from just the material matter of our universe. And so am I. So one reason I would tend to favor theism over atheism, it seems like there's a more natural, easy, flowing explanation in theism for something such as consciousness or meaning than there is in naturalism. And again, I'm trying to be cautious here, Tom, and not say, well, therefore, Christianity is true. I'm not really saying that. I'm saying I'm more drawn to something that gives me an easier and more natural explanation, especially when I see leading atheists, really struggling with this. And I'm shouting at the book as I'm reading it, hey, God gave us the gift of consciousness. It's sitting there right in front of you. So I guess I'm drawn to that explanation as being preferable.
Well, when I hear that, it reminds me a lot of 2,000 years ago when talking about lightning. Like we see how there's this thing, kind of like morality, that we experience and we can't explain it. And with all of our understanding of the natural world, it doesn't explain what this thing is. And it's easy to explain if we say, well, hey, we can smack a hammer against a rock and create this electrical thing. And so probably that electricity is caused by a big guy with a big hammer in the sky smashing it against a rock. And we got Hephaestus
Right.
and Zeus. And
Right.
so it seems like it's a natural, easier way to explain lightning, to say it's created by a human just because we can do certain things that we can relate to the what we see around us. But it doesn't seem to me that that's a really good argument or that's evidence of some kind. It's more of like an intuitive feeling. It's like an anthropomorphism. Because for it to be actual evidence, you'd have to like demonstrate this or use the verifiable way, some way to demonstrate it's not just an imaginary correlation rather than causation kind of a thing. And so to me, it seems exactly the same as the lightning example, where we're just saying we can relate to this, and so because we can relate to this, we're going to extrapolate from that this is caused by a mind, and that doesn't really seem to be evidence to me. Just the fact that it's intuitively makes sense, because our intuitions aren't really reliable. Like many people use the argument that time can't bend because time isn't a physical thing as an argument against Einstein's general relativity, and they were just wrong. It does. It literally bends, and nature just doesn't care about our intuitions at all. So it seems to me that the argument you're making is very similar to the argument that people would be making about lightning or fairy circles or the motion of the sun in the sky. It seems very similar to me.
Yeah, it doesn't to me. Uh, it seems that in Christian theism, um, you more naturally go from divine consciousness to human consciousness. You more naturally go from divine meaning to human meaning. You more naturally, logically, I would even say, Tom, that's what I mean by naturally, more logically and reasonably go from divine value to human value. Okay, set those here. Then if you go from matter and energy to consciousness, that seems not as logical to me. Or go from matter and energies, pure materiality, to value, to true value, that seems illogical to me. That's an illogical jump. And so I prefer to be over here. These make more sense to me logically, but at the same time, I realize that I could be wrong about this. That what Nagel is suggesting is we need a new paradigm of science in order to get us to consciousness. And if that happens, and it can be shown that God is not needed at all, well, then I would listen to that. But until it comes, I'm playing a little bit of the God of the gaps, but I also think you're playing a little bit of the science of the gaps. We don't know what this is going to be. We kind of have a faith in the future that there is going to be a natural explanation. And in terms of value, that would be much harder. Value and meaning seem like more philosophical properties than physical ones. And so to go from physicality to philosophical, you can do that with God. It's going to be a lot harder to do that with naturalism.
Right. So that's why I brought up the example of time, because time was the same kind of thing. Time was more of a philosophical concept rather than a physical concept.
Yep.
But then we discovered, oh yeah, it's actually physical. So nature can pull a fast one on us, and
Oh yeah.
the idea that something is philosophical doesn't mean it actually that's what it is. It could
Right.
still be a physical process. And
Yes.
so it seems to me like when you brought up the science of the gaps, when I think of science of the gaps, I think of that's just an induction. Like if we say white goose, white goose, white goose, white goose, white goose, it's not white goose of the gaps. I mean, just reasonable to think the next one's going to be a white goose because of induction. It would only be a gaps argument if you thought it was something different. Because if you thought it was a black goose, then that would be a black goose of the gaps. But
Yeah.
I wouldn't really call it a white goose of the gaps in that case, because that seems to be the reasonable conclusion. Or would you disagree with that?
No, I would agree with that. I think science has got a shot at a lot of these things. Let me go to gray goose. You got white goose. I'll go to gray goose. That God, who gave us the gift of science and gave us the gift of life, that's my gray goose. And then God did it over and over and over. So it's gray goose, gray goose, gray goose, gray goose. I can barely pronounce this. Gray goose. And then someday there'll be some new revelation, some new understanding of the world. But God was still involved all the way along. And God discloses the world to us through the gift of science and through the gift of explanation that he's given us. So I'm saying there's a parallel line of geese here, and they're gray to your whites. And the next gray goose would be in line with a theistic understanding of the world, just as the next white goose would be in line with a naturalistic understanding of the world.
Well, could you give me an example of one gray goose? Like, what would be an example? Because it could be the case that God did do all of these things indirectly, but I don't think that would count as evidence of a God. You couldn't say that's actually a gray goose unless you could demonstrate that this had some connection to the supernatural in some
Yeah.
way.
Well, I guess I'm actually starting with God. I'm not arguing to God. I'm saying when you put the worldviews on the board, the one I'm most drawn to that seems to provide the most internally coherent explanations and the most comprehensive external explanations of the world seems to be this one worldview. So I sometimes feel cornered by atheists who say, well, of course, we're all starting with naturalism. Now, what evidence do you have for theism? How are you going to get there from where we are? And I'm saying, no, wait a second. I'm not standing in the corner with you on this. I'm already over there. I'm already evaluating them, and I've chosen that one based on its merits. So I don't feel necessarily obligated to provide naturalistic evidence to get us from naturalism to theism. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would go back to the point where I was saying we need some way to differentiate between imaginary things and non-imaginary things, like things that exist. And the way I do that is with future testable predictions. Now I know natural things can pass the test of future testable predictions, so we have pretty good reason to believe they're not imaginary. Now I don't know of a different methodology other than future testable predictions that can also work, and I don't know of any supernatural examples that pass that test. So as far as I'm aware, I don't know of any supernatural things that can be demonstrated to not be imaginary. They all seem to be able to, any
Right.
criteria you put up to compare the supernatural things work equally as well for, like with the examples you gave before of leprechauns and fairies and
Yeah.
miracles and magic and all those kinds of things. So I don't see a way to differentiate between the gray goose and the supernatural as being not imaginary, and all of the other imaginary things. They seem to have equal footing as far as I can tell. And not just on the naturalistic footing, I mean by any criteria. I don't know of a criteria that can really differentiate between those two.
Right. Yeah, we could have a really long discussion probably about criteria and what constitutes allowable criteria for evaluating these things. Uh, One thing I'd be concerned about if I was in the naturalistic camp, and honestly, I could be someday, but if I were there, I guess I'd be concerned about singularities, that supernatural events,
By singularity, are you talking in physics singularity?
no, singular events, events that are not repeatable and therefore not testable and therefore not subject to verification principle. I guess I'd want also some sort of criteria, if I was a naturalist, to allow me to investigate singular events or claims of singular events. So in Christian theism, the central singular event is the resurrection of Christ. Well, it's not testable scientifically, it's not verifiable scientifically, but under different criteria, you can make a very good case for the resurrection of Christ from a historical perspective. So if I were a naturalist and I allowed for testimony, and if I allowed for historiography as part of my evidence gathering, then I would have a way to evaluate miracles. Because here's what my friend Michael does. He writes them all off in advance. He says, well, since they're not testable, they're not repeatable, you can't put them in a lab, you can't put them under sort of conditions where we can, in an unbiased way, figure out what was going on there. Therefore, it didn't happen. And I said, Michael, that just sounds like dogma to me, not the true scientific spirit, spirit of openness to new phenomena. So all that to say, I guess I'd want some criteria that would allow me to investigate singular events such as miracles. And I'm just wondering if the verifiability principle really allows for that, Tom.
Oh, you're right, it doesn't. But I don't know of anything that does. I don't know of a criteria that can provide that. And like I said, my standard is what really qualifies as evidence is you have to have some way that can differentiate whatever you're arguing for is not an imaginary thing, and that's what qualifies as evidence. Now, if there is some particular event, a singular event that isn't testable or verifiable, how would we differentiate that from an imaginary thing that didn't happen, or one imaginary thing that was a singular event that didn't happen? I know of no way to do that. The
Right.
only ways I can demonstrate that something isn't imaginary is if it is repeatable and happens multiple times.
Right.
Now, if theism provides a way to do that, it doesn't have to be a naturalistic way. I'm totally fine with any way that if you provide a methodology to differentiate between imaginary and real, I'm good with that. I don't care if it's natural or supernatural or whatever. Any method that can do that is evidence for me. But I don't know of any method other than science, or if any method that does work is not itself adopted by science.
Right. Uh, yeah, if I was committed to a kind of scientism, that's what I would say as well, but I'm not. I'm I'm reluctant to make rules, I guess, about what constitutes persuasive argument and persuasive evidence. To me, anything has the potential to be persuasive. So to use an extreme example, I don't really hold to this, but if Harry Potter showed up at my door and then Hagrid showed up after that, and then they kept showing up, and then they told me about this magic world out there, and they, perform tricks and so forth, and maybe not even on every time. It wasn't verifiable, it wasn't on cue. I mean, I would at least listen. Now that's an extreme example, but I use an extreme example to show the idea that I'm reluctant to make rules in advance about what constitutes evidence, and I'm reluctant to make rules about what might be persuasive to me. So I find the early church's testimony about Jesus and his miracles and his resurrection very persuasive. And I find very persuasive the reports of miracles that are sprinkled throughout the churches that I interact with. Some of them are probably false or exaggerated or whatever. I'm fine with that, but probably not all of them. And when I interact with the quality of people and I hear the quality of testimony and the multiple people who've seen just amazing things happen, that's persuasive to me. And I wouldn't want a rule in place that would prevent me from being open to that and listening to that, because it could very well be that that's how God wants to disclose himself to me. And if he does, I don't want to put up a barrier. I don't want to shut a door where that might be the case.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't want to put any restrictions on what qualifies as evidence, other than the fact that it has to be able to differentiate between imaginary and non-imaginary. If it can
Right.
do that, it's evidence, whatever it is. I don't know what it is, but
Okay. Yeah.
so I
And
mean, would you
now,
agree with that part as much?
yeah, yeah, I think I'm with you on that, because and maybe just the place that we differ, Tom, is that what you find persuasive and what I find persuasive are two different things. I'm kind of open to the testimony of just lay people and their experiences to guide me into possible truth, especially if that truth fits with the other more philosophical parts of my worldview. And it sounds like you really wouldn't be open to that kind of testimony.
Well, right, because I don't believe it can differentiate between imaginary and real. So
Yeah.
I would say that the testimony thing doesn't pass that test that we both agreed to, that it has to be able to differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real. Because when I think of testimony, and I look at the testimony of the Bible, which I've studied pretty thoroughly, it seems to be the case that there's far better testimony for other miracles and other religious cases, for Hindu miracles, for Santi Sai Baba's miracles, for homeopathy, for aliens, UFOs. We have more contemporary eyewitnesses for those things, and Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and witchcraft and other spiritual ghost things. It seems like that just going off of testimony, we have better evidence for all of those other cases, far more of it, far more contemporary examples, more reliable people. We see these kinds of things like UFOs from pilots all the time, where they see there's some kind of a phenomenon where pilots often see an unidentified flying object when they're piloting, and it's pretty a common experience. So it
Sure.
seems to me that like the number of eyewitness testimonies and there being contemporary eyewitness testimonies doesn't seem to support that this isn't an imaginary thing. Like, for example, the example I use is, if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable. If I told you I saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable. The testimony alone isn't what makes it reasonable to believe. You have to have a testimony plus something else.
Yeah, and I think the something else is the philosophical components of my worldview, that Christian miracles fit with the Christian worldview, and the Christian worldview is not only internally coherent, but externally provides explanatory power. If the miracles were just dangling out there by themselves and I had no worldview grid in which to fit them, or if I had a Hindu grid to fit them into, then that would be a different matter. But I do have a grid where they fit logically. And so I guess I'm more likely to believe in miracles that are done in the name of Jesus. Or I shouldn't say it more likely. Let me be careful what I'm saying here. I am likely to believe claims of miracles in the name of Jesus. A little bit smaller claim there. I'm likely to believe those claims because they fit with a worldview that I already have. Now, is it possible that there are miracles, non-natural events in other religions? I'm very open to that possibility. There could be other elements of the spiritual realm out there that God has allowed or God has created, or that there's an enemy, Satan or whatever. All those things are possible. And so I'm not saying that Christian miracles are the exclusive miracles in the world. I'd be sort of agnostic about that, honestly. But it's pretty easy for me to be believe in Christian miracles when I already have a worldview that they fit logically into.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. You said that the Christian worldview is more internally consistent. Uh, like I've already argued that naturalism can also explain the external things that we experience, the morality and the values. But what do you mean when you say Christianity is more internally consistent?
That the cosmological argument fits hand in glove with the teleological argument. So existence fits with design. Design fits with beauty and aesthetics. Beauty and aesthetics fits with my experience of being a person created in the image of God. Being in the image of God and saying no to God means that I'm fallen away from God, and now the world, which is both good and bad, and myself, which is both good and bad, fits with this idea of having fallen away from a caring and good God who had other designs on my life and other designs on the world. All of that makes sense with itself. But I don't think, and others, I could go on into ethics and the coming of Christ and so forth. I don't think that internal coherence is sufficient, though, because you could just write a story. You know, an author, back to Hogwarts, you can write a story and create a whole world, and it has its own internal consistency. That doesn't make it true. But Christianity as a worldview not only has internal coherence where the puzzle pieces fit together with each other, but it does provide explanation for all of reality and experience as I know it anyway. And to me, that's extremely compelling, and that's why I hold to it.
Well, like you said, you could just write a story to explain all of that. So
Yeah,
the
you could.
fact that there is an internal consistency there really seems to be more of like here's a story. Now the question is this story true or not? And it seems to me that just like theism can create an internally consistent story, naturalism can create an internally consistent story, and so could anybody else. So I don't see how that's really evidence, because both the internal and external can be explained equally by theism and naturalism, as far as I can tell. They can both create logically internally consistent stories, and they can both explain everything we see around us. But to me, that doesn't give us a way to differentiate: is this imaginary or is this real? So I go back to my original criterion: is how do you differentiate between the imaginary and the real? And the internal consistency doesn't seem to do it, and the miracles don't seem to do it, and the historicity. I've had some pretty interesting conversations about the historicity. I mean, but the historicity is the testimony doesn't really seem to do it. Those all don't seem to provide a way to differentiate between the imaginary and the real, whereas science does, as far as I can tell. I think we both agree with that. That science does give us a way to do that.
Super helpful. Yeah. Well, now we're getting to person relative arguments and person relative persuasion. To you, it doesn't provide a way to differentiate, but to me, it does.
Also, could you explain that?
Yeah, that if someone came along and made an argument for unicorns, I would listen to it. But I guess I would want to know, does belief in unicorns provide answers to the basic worldview questions about existence, about design, about ethics, about meaningful human relationships, about subjectivity, all those sorts of things? And if the person said yes, and they could fill it in with the intellectual resources and elements that would do that, I mean, I would listen to that, you know. But I don't see that forthcoming either with unicorns or with Santa Claus. And if it did, it would start to sound more and more like Christian theism. Well, this unicorn is the creator of the universe. Okay, well, that sounds like the creator of the universe I'm talking about. Well, this unicorn created human beings in its image. Okay, well, you call it a unicorn, I call it Yahweh. Okay, so the more it sounded like classic theism, then the more I'd be persuaded, well, then maybe it's true and I just got the wrong terminology. Because it's really the substance of theism itself that is not only internally coherent, but explains the world. And I don't see arguments about Santa Claus or fairies or unicorns or the flying spaghetti monster. I don't see those coming forth in a philosophically coherent way that I think theism provides. And you probably don't think theism provides that, but I do, and that's where we have these parallel universes.
Well, I'd actually argue it from a different way. I would say that what I see as the major difference is that you see theism as special, that theism can provide a coherent answer that other ideologies can't provide. Whereas I
Yeah,
think that
yeah,
the answers provided by theism can be matched one for one by the spaghetti monster. But I would prefer a more serious alternative like naturalistic
sure.
pantheism
Yep.
or
Yeah,
deism or polytheism or transtheism or panentheism, panendeism, omnism. There's a bunch of different alternatives to theism, and any of those alternatives that can have like the property of all powerful, essentially all powerful, eternal, and necessary, as long as they have those three properties, anything that has those three properties can explain everything. And so I
yeah,
think anything that has those properties is essentially a metaphysical theory of everything. And any metaphysical theory of everything can provide answers, the same kinds of answers that you say that theism provides. And so to me, it's like, what caused the cup to fall over? It could be the wind, it could be the bird, it could be the squirrel, it could be a god or theism, deism, pantheism, polytheism. Anything could explain all of these different aspects of life and give us a coherent worldview. But I don't see a way to differentiate between one as being real and the others being the imaginary ones. I see them all on equal footing. I don't see a way to differentiate, which is why I just stick with the naturalism. Naturalism, we don't know what any of the answers to these questions are. We just stop it. This is what we can demonstrate, and then we go home.
sure. If I agreed with that, if I thought naturalism was as internally coherent and provided compelling external explanations for the universe and experience, if I thought they were equal, then I'd be a divided man. But in my judgment, they're not equal.
But I
And
actually agree with you there. So my argument is a little more. So naturalism on its own doesn't tell us anything about these ultimate questions. It doesn't answer them. It just says we don't know. But the naturalist can go further than that and say we can also come up with answers to these questions. We can say objective morality is an undiscovered law of nature. We can say that there is an all-powerful aspect of general relativity that we haven't discovered yet. We can say there is some part of quantum mechanics which causes the fine-tuning because of the interconnectivity of the boundary conditions. So we can come up with answers to all of those questions and make it internally consistent, just like theism is, as far as I can tell, for one. Explain it exactly the same with the exact same level of compellingness, I guess would be the, I'm not sure what the
sure,
right word there.
oh, that's fine.
So we it's not just naturalism, it's naturalism plus. We can
Yeah,
add to naturalism to come up with the same level of explanatory power. The naturalists just usually don't do that. So which is
sure.
what I refer to as naturalistic pantheism.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm with you on a lot of this, Tom. In one sense, we are really close. In another sense, I know we're universe apart. But I agree that naturalism has a lot of potential in the way that you described. I guess I have a philosophical preference for a worldview that provides current explanations rather than a worldview that provides possible future explanations. I don't have enough faith in those possible future explanations that naturalism is somehow going to get us from a meaningless universe to a meaningful universe. I don't have faith for that. I can't look into the future and recommend naturalism for that reason. In theism, I've already got that. I've already got the universe as, by definition, it's meaningful because it's given to us by a God who is the essence of meaning. And so if I thought of naturalism could provide that as well as theism, then I'd jump or I'd have a foot in both worlds or something like that. But all I'm saying is that I have a philosophical preference for current explanations over a preference over the possibility of future potential explanations inside a worldview that, to me, those are dubious. I know that you're saying we could imagine them and they're probably going to be there because white goose, white goose, white goose. I'm dubious about that. I don't, I'm not with you on that part.
All right, that's a really good point. So let me be a little more clear. When I say that, I'm saying we can come up with current explanations that are natural that explain it right now, not things we could potentially discover in the future. We could have scientists make up some property, like for example, some aspect of reality, some new particle or new principle, and then use mathematical ways to fit it into string theory or something, and it'll be a current explanation of morality and values and things just like theism is. So I would say that we can come up with natural explanations that are equally as current to explain morality as theism does. Now, neither of these are testable or verifiable, which is why they don't use them in science. But we can add the non-testable, non-verifiable aspects to both theories to come up with a modern, current explanation of morality and purpose and meaning and value to both theories.
So are you saying that you're willing to incorporate really important, big concepts into your worldview that are not testable and not verifiable? Is that what you're saying? I might be misunderstanding you there.
Forgive me for how this may be a little patronizing. Forgive me, but the argument I'm trying to make is that scientists can make stuff up too. So, just like from my perspective, the theist is going beyond the evidence to make an argument for something that we can't differentiate from the imaginary. The scientist can do the same thing. So, if you can add in a being that has the powerful, all-knowing, all-loving properties, we can take those same properties and add them to natural things like undiscovered laws, and have a modern, current explanation of those things, just like the theist does. Neither are verifiable, so I wouldn't include them in my worldview. I don't think it's reasonable, but both worldviews can do it equally.
Yeah, both worldviews can do it, period. The equally part is where I'm not quite with you. I just don't see that naturalism has the resources to go from material reality to meaningful value. To me, that's two different worlds. It's implausible and illogical to my thinking. And so I'm dubious that that can ever really happen. I'm not dubious that scientists could sit around and come up with ideas where this could happen. But in Christian theism, it happens naturally. In naturalism, that would be very unnatural, ironically, for that to happen. And so personally, I'm just more persuaded by a worldview that naturally gives us the objective and the subjective side by side, relative to naturalism, which gives us the objective but struggles with more of the subjective sides of existence and experience.
Right, that totally makes sense to me. So, from my perspective, the theist answers don't work. I don't think that those are actual answers, but I think that if you think those are answers, I can create equivalent answers for naturalism that can match essentially the same criteria, whatever criteria you can come up with of why the theist answers work. I can match that criteria and come up with an answer that is naturalistic. Like, for example, why do you believe that? What is it about God that grounds morality? Is it use the Euthyphro dilemma, for example? Is something good because God says it's good, or is something good, or does God say something is good for some other reason?
Well, it seems to me morality is grounded in the character of God, and the character of God is good and holy, and that provides actually a lot of grounding and a lot of what do you call it? Moral obligations, grounds for moral obligations.
So it's grounded in his nature. That's what you would say, right?
In his character, yeah.
Well, so could God lie?
Well, I want to be super careful when I answer this, because you can get into these little logical conundrums of, can God create a rock that's bigger than he can lift? And I don't really want to go down that alley, because I don't think those are meaningful arguments. But can God lie? So is it metaphysically possible, philosophically possible, for God to lie, but he chooses not to? Or is it actually impossible for God to lie, therefore he doesn't? And I don't know, Tom.
Well, I'm not going that detailed into it. I'm just asking, like God wouldn't lie because of his nature or something. So his nature prevents him from lying in some sense.
Okay, if we're going a little bit later on that topic, then I'll grant that.
Right. So I would say that it's specifically God's nature that grounds morality, and his character is kind of a result of his nature. What he chooses to do, lie or not lie, is kind of determined by his nature. Would that be?
Well, nature and character, I mean, those are deep philosophical issues, and I'm not quite willing to grant how quickly you went from nature to character there. But if it doesn't matter to your argument, we can say something along those lines might be the case.
Well, I would say the same thing can apply to pantheism, where we can have pantheism's nature can ground morality in the same way that God's nature can ground morality.
Okay. If pantheism's nature then is good, or if pantheism's nature is evil, how might that give me guidance on whether or not I should cheat on my wife or cheat on my income taxes or love my enemy?
Well, how does it do it for God? It's just like a reflection of his nature, right? That's what makes it
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, and God has revealed it. It's not just a nature that's hidden to us. It's revealed in Christian thinking, in the Christian worldview. It's revealed to us in the law of Moses and in the teachings of Jesus, roughly speaking. Again, I don't want to get too detailed on that.
Right, right.
So it's revealed to us, and so we have some go-to resources, but it's hard to see where those go-to resources might be in a meaningless material universe.
Right. So there's 2 points there. One is the difference between epistemology and ontology. One is what is the case, and the second is how we know. So we can say that the nature of pantheism can ground objective morality, and that could be ontology, what is the case, regardless of whether or not we know it. So whether or not it transitions into us or not, it could still be the objective grounds of morality. Now, to answer the second question, I can give us an epistemology and say the nature of pantheism is expressed in a law like gravity that just permeates everything, and that is like a moral law, and that interacts with our brains to give us these moral sensations. So I can answer that question too, but those are two separate questions.
Yeah, no, I agree. They are separate questions. If God kept it all to himself, in the Christian worldview, if God kept it all to himself, there might be an ontology of ethics, but no epistemology of ethics, because we wouldn't know what the heck it was.
Right.
But in your case, I'm still wondering how I know if I should cheat on my wife or not, and would living in a, and if that's a universal principle somehow, would living in a different culture change that?
Right. No, I'd say it's a law of nature like gravity. Like we can't fight gravity. Gravity applies to everyone equally, whether you want it to or not, unless you eat too many cheeseburgers, then it may apply more to you than other people. But so essentially, I would see morality could be a law of nature that just permeates the universe just like gravity does, and it affects our brains and causes us to feel these moral obligations in a certain way. So it applies to everyone equally. It doesn't change by culture. It's objective in the sense that it applies to everyone, and it's every sense of objective.
Okay. And how do we know that that's the case? A, how do we know it's universal? And B, how do we know what the content of it is?
Well, I would say the same way that the theists argue for morality is that moral intuition and moral progress.
Okay. But in theism, I've got some actual content, some written, revealed content to go to that I can base my judgments on. In naturalism, it sounds like it's more just my moral intuitions and kind of how culture works it out. And I'm not sure that culture is a very reliable guide for morality.
From my understanding, essentially the basis of objective morality from the theist philosophers, what they usually hear is that it's the basis is moral intuition and moral progress. It's not specifically that the words in the Bible are themselves the basis. It's the fact that we have something ingrained in our soul or something like that.
Yeah, that would be a secondary. I mean, that would be what's in us that connects with the written revelation. But really, it all gets back. Moral controversies and ethical decisions are made not just on our evolving human intuitions among Christians. They're made in reference to an immovable reference point, and that is roughly speaking, the law of Moses and the teachings of Jesus.
So, from my understanding, people still have that moral sense, even if they haven't read the Bible. They still have that
Yeah,
attachment or understanding of objective morality, even without the Bible.
right. Yeah.
So, I would make the same argument for pantheism and say they still have that connection to objective morality through the law of nature and how it interacts with us
Yeah.
internally.
I think we're on even footing there, Tom. I like that argument. I guess I'm saying that there's an addition to the moral intuition that we have also connects with more objective revealed content. So in Christianity, there's both, and they're both important. Because if we didn't have a sense of morality, we wouldn't care about the moral content of the Bible. And if we only had moral intuition but no content to refer to, then it would be a crapshoot of whatever that came out to be, and we wouldn't have any specific moral guidance.
So that's an interesting perspective because from my interpretation, I would see the stuff written in the Bible is not a lot of it's immoral to me. The lots of
Okay,
the
great.
killings
Yeah.
and things. So
Yeah.
it's hard for me to relate to what you're saying in the fact that the Bible is a grounds of objective morality, especially when a lot of the commandments are really silly. Don't eat shellfish, or I don't remember some of them, but the first one, love the Lord thy God as no other, something like that. Don't kill, don't steal, no adultery. Don't remember the
Yeah.
rest of them, but some of them aren't really that great. And there's some that should be on there that aren't, like don't own other human beings as property. I would include that one in there for sure.
Yeah. No, I mean, that is a great point. I really like that. That just because something is written down in a religion doesn't make it actually good. And so a fruitful discussion then would be about biblical ethics and how is it that Christians interpret the Bible to come up with what we think is a really strong grounding for moral obligation, whereas other people read the Bible and they go, well, this isn't that great. What are all these dumb commands, especially in the Old Testament? What do we do with those? And don't they just muck up the proceedings here? And are you just conveniently ignoring those? I mean, if I was an atheist, that's the sorts of things I'd be saying. Well, that is what my atheist friends say to me. So then now we're into theology and into how to interpret the Bible. And so now you walk through the processes of theological reflection and see what comes of it to what I would say properly read and understand the Bible. And that's probably for another time for you and me.
Yeah, so I would the one last point I wanted to touch on was essentially I've come up with an argument against like essentially like the problem of suffering. From my perspective, if there was really an all good, all powerful God, that it would have given each individual the option to live in this world that the God designed, or it would have given us the option to live in a different world of our own design or one we prefer. And if it forced us to live in one world without our consent, that would be by definition slavery and by definition immoral, which would mean that there couldn't be an all good, all powerful God under the Christian definition because that God would be by definition immoral. So, from
Mhm.
my perspective, that is a very big problem for what you call an internally consistent worldview because the Christian worldview does not seem to be internally consistent as far as I can tell. If there
Yeah,
was really an all good, all powerful God, he would have given us the option to live in this world or another instead of forcing us to be here without our consent. Each individual.
yeah. So you have a standard of fairness here, a standard of human flourishing
Or
that,
I'd say objective morality. I wrote in a model of objective morality because I do
okay,
believe I'm a
yeah,
moral realist. So,
right. Okay. Yes. Yes, you are. I know that about you, which I appreciate. So you have an objective moral realism imported from a different worldview that the God of Christianity is not meeting, is not living up to, and therefore that counts against, maybe decisively counts against even the existence of this other God. Certainly, if the Christian God exists in your mind, then it counts against the moral nature of the Christian God. Is that what you're saying?
yes, because I would see that from what we can understand of morality, slavery is obviously bad, and it would be a morally superior world based on essentially whatever criteria we want to look at if we were given the option to be in this world or the option to not be in this world. If we were forced to be here against our will, that must be immoral. There's no way that that could be justified logically. It's like a square circle. It would always be more moral to give us the option than to force us to be here without consent.
Yeah. Have you read William Rowe on this, Tom?
I believe so a long time ago.
Yeah, me too, a long time ago. Yeah, William Rowe said there's just, famous atheist philosopher said there's gratuitous evil in the world, evil that doesn't serve any purpose. And it sounds like, Tom, you're saying that the evil that we partake of in this world, it doesn't serve any purpose. In fact, if God were really moral and just, he'd have given us the option of being in a different world. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say that specifically just the one evil of forcing us to be here without consent.
Right. Forcing us to be here without our consent. Right. Okay. Yeah. Let me give that some thought. I haven't really heard it put that way specifically. I guess my first inclination is to say that God created the best of all possible worlds in the world that he did create, And in giving us free will, which was also a maximal property in that world, we chose to exercise it against him and screwed up the world. I mean, that's my first impulse, but I don't know if that quite takes account of all that you're implying there. And honestly, Tom, I don't know that I'm equipped right on the spot like this to give a really well thought through answer to what you're saying about this idea of slavery.
Oh, that's totally fair. I'd like to respond a little bit to what you said there, because the point of this argument was to respond to the free will defense, Plantinga's free will defense. But
Okay.
it's so in this world I'm describing, we still have free will. We can still have free will because we have the option to be in this world, and so we have everything in this world plus the option to go to a different world. So everything
Yep.
we have in this world, including all of the free will, the possibility of suffering and learning and getting to know God through the experience, and to do good through all of the bad things, all of those are there. The only difference is that they're optional for those who want to experience them as opposed to those who don't. And to me, that seems to be a moral addition that was not there, or probably was not there, unless we all chose to be here and just forgot about it or something.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying human dignity is a super high value for you, and it seems like God has just trumped it. He's in his power. He has severely limited human dignity in this way, and if he were just, he would not have done that. Is that right?
Sort of. I'm not sure what you would mean by dignity. It's not really specific in my mind what that would mean, but I would just see this forcing us to be here without consent. I would see as immoral.
Okay. Okay.
But if you want to call it dignity, I'm okay with that.
Okay. Yeah. Uh, yeah. I don't know that I have anything really great right off the top of my head because I haven't heard that specific. I've heard the general argument that you're making, but nothing with that level of specificity. So I don't know that I'm quite ready to respond in a way that represents. Christians could be watching this or unbelievers, and I could end up giving a thoughtless response, and I wouldn't want to do that.
That's fair.
So I don't mean to cop out, but I'm just being honest here.
Okay, well that's totally fine. Yeah, Dr. Chris Gadsden said the same thing because this is my original argument. I made it up, so it's not a surprise you haven't heard it before.
Okay. Okay. Well, it gives me something to think about, and probably you and I hang out once in a while, so maybe you could bring it up in person sometime, and we could just think it through together, and then maybe we could go back on the air sometime and talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've been going for about an hour, so I think it would be a good time to wrap up right there. So,
Okay, you going to close in prayer or what?
yeah, sure. I pray to the spaghetti monster. Please give me more spaghetti. So,
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it, and I'm glad your show has been successful. And consider having me on again. I'll do it.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. It was a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to learning guitar with you sometime.
Okay, let's do it. Okay, take care, Tom.
Bye.
Okay, bye.